Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the NRW. I'm your host, Rob Medina, and I thank you all very much for joining me here today because today I'm going to be reviewing the movie Blood In, Blood Out. Now, this year marks the 30-year anniversary of this film's release because this movie came out back in April 30th, 1993. And I remember, hearing first about this film when I was a little kid. I'll be honest with you, I don't remember any reason why I never checked out the film. I just remember hearing about it because I think I heard about it in school for the first time. I think it might have been towards the end of my elementary years and early middle school years, somewhere around that time frame, where I've seen a lot of kids had talked about this movie. But the how I remembered it was more how they were describing it as basically it's like a mafia film with a bunch of Mexicans in East Los Angeles. That's how I kind of remember it being described at that time. That's the only thing that really stuck out for me. I'm sure they said some other things along the way too. But then it wasn't until after I had seen The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 and then Part 3, where a friend of mine had told me, have you ever seen Blood In, Blood Out? When I went to go visit him, I said, no, I have not. He said, well, you should watch that movie. You like The Godfather? I was like, well, I love that movie. He's like, well, then you're going to love this film. It's basically about these gangs, this bunch of guys who are in a gang, and they make some bad choices, and then one goes to prison, one becomes a cop, and the other one's like a drug addict, and how they're all like just their lives are just all sorts of fucked up. And then along the way, they find more or less their the real path, and it's questionable, but it's an awesome movie. And I thought, okay, well, that sounds really interesting. So I ended up watching the film that day. And when I saw the movie for the first time, I fell in love with that movie. I was like, this is basically like more or less kind of like the Hispanic Godfather, if you will, because a lot of things that I remember distinctly taken away from this movie was that this was actually the first time for someone like myself, even though I am Hispanic, but there are a lot of cultures out there in the Hispanic community that I'm not really that familiar with. And one of them was the Chicano culture. I've been around a lot of Mexicans, but I was never really familiar with the Chicano culture because I'm out from the East Coast. I live in Northern Virginia, which is just outside of DC, where I grew up. So there really just wasn't a lot of that culture out there. And if there ever was, it might have been just from people who were visiting. Because I remember seeing some like Chicanos, like some more or less like cholos, if you will, is the best way to describe it. I don't know if it's considered an insult now. If it is, I apologize. I don't mean to be that way. But I've only seen that once in a blue moon from someone who was from East Los Angeles coming over to the East Coast in the area that I lived at. But that was the extent of it. Outside of that, I wasn't really that familiar with it. So when I saw the movie, there was a lot that I had learned about that culture. And then along the way, I had done a little bit more research about the making of this film and the authenticity that this movie actually had when it came to the Chicano culture, I meant to say. So I thought that there was so much about that film that I thought was quite beautiful to give a window of American culture, if you will, that I think maybe some people may not be aware of, especially for me at that time. So it was a really educational film for me as well. But at the same time, I just appreciated that I just got a really, really good film from the lenses of people who are making this movie to not only just make a great film, but just give a piece of the opportunity to check out something that we may have never seen before, but be told in an epic fashion. So I thought that was really a wonderful thing about this movie. So there's so much about this film that I can get into, but there's only so much time that I have time to be able to delve into it here. I will point out that there's a lot that goes on in this plot that I'll be getting into in a little bit that I will not be able to cover here. So I'm just going to focus on just more or less the three main characters that we're going to follow in this movie, which I'll point on a little bit here. So of course, I'll get into the plot synopsis. I will also get into my positives, my negatives, and then my rating. In East Los Angeles, three cousins raised as brothers fiercely live by a generations-old tradition of family, a power stronger than law, a force deeper than friendship. In one life-shattering moment, the trio is torn apart, forcing them to follow three separate paths, one searching for the truth and law, the other expressing his passion through art, and one finding power in prison. Yet through it all, family and honor keep their lives intertwined as each strives for survival and power. And that right there is the film in a nutshell. So now let's get into my positives. My first positive with this movie is that this is a very, very strong film. And we have a very strong story, very well laid out, very methodical as well, too. Because this movie runs about, well, at least the director's cut runs around 3 hours and 10 minutes, if I recall correctly. I should know this by now because I've seen the movies well over 15 times at this point. But what's beautiful about this film is that you have a great story, but the funny thing is that there's several different stories that are going on at once because we're following three different characters, each of them going through their respective paths, and in one way, shape, or form, they're intertwining with each other, despite the fact there's a lot of distance between them, which we'll get into in a little bit here. but you have the time to breathe and be able to absorb each story. And although there are several different stories going on at the same time with each of these respective characters, there is something about the way that they're laying up these foundations, if you will, and how each character that we come across does serve a purpose for the overall narrative. It's not a wasted opportunity. There's really no wasted characters, I would say. And there certainly are certain elements of the story that I felt like where you have a big payoff because you have the time to build up to something. And then once you get to that build up, the payoff is very satisfactory, at least for someone like myself. And I'm sure with a lot of other people who have also seen this film may feel the same way as well. But the most important thing is that the story that we're following here in this film, that each of these characters that we're following do have a very compelling story to tell, that when you get to the end of the film, the payoff is nothing more than satisfactory. It's actually quite fulfilling in a lot of ways. I think it's the best way I could describe it. And then the one thing I'm also going to give a major set of props to are the three actors that we follow in this film. And Jesse Borrego, who plays the character of Crucito, and we also have Benjamin Bratt, who plays the character of Paco Aguilar, and then we also have Damien Chapa, who I think a lot of people tend to lean more towards as being one of the favorite characters in this movie, who plays Miklo Velka, I meant to say. Each of these actors deliver some of their best performances that I've come across throughout their careers from what I've seen so far up to this point. Because there are moments where you get to see some lightheartedness, you get to see some real toughness come out of them, you get to see some fear come out of them as well too, and you also see concern, you see a lot of genuine happiness, and then you see some real built-up rage in various stages of their life, and just heartbreak along the way too, that they all handle in some way or shape or form that's completely different considering the circumstances that they're dealt with here. So it makes sense why they're going through all these different wavelengths of emotions, because again, you have the time to breathe, to be able to absorb all that and be able to process it as well too. And every one of these actors delivers some strong performances that I would even go as far as saying, I mean, I as much as I say I don't care, but to some degree I do, because it does offer some validation to a degree, is that they all would have been very worthy of receiving an Oscar nomination for their respective performances, because each one of these actors delivers some top tier performances that really goes on par with a lot of these legendary actors that we can think of as well too, especially at that time, who were delivering some great performances like Daniel Day-Lewis, Al Pacino. Like, it's just, I really do believe that it's on that same level of performance that we're getting out of these respective actors. So when you have a strong set of actors delivering great performances for these characters, and then you have a set of great supporting actors along the way too that are also complementing that, but also being a part of the narrative as well too, serving their purpose, because it all makes sense for the overall story that we're following here in this film. One other thing I also want to point out too, because I had this conversation with Kuya P, who runs our channel here in NRW, I think almost 2 years ago, if I recall correctly. He was actually my third guest on my show, You're So Cool with Rob Medina. And in that conversation that I had with him, I had brought up about a particular story that I remember coming across, where there was a Asian director who was very upset that this production company or studio had hired a white man to tell a story dealing heavily with the Chinese culture. And this director felt like, why would you do that? Why would you take away an opportunity to give a white man to direct a film about Chinese culture, Chinese story, if you will? And it was one of those things where I remember at the time thinking, yeah, why would you do that? But in that conversation, when I talked with Kuya P about that, I remember my what's the word I want to say? When I was learning about the production of Blood In, Blood Out, that it was directed by a white guy by the name of Taylor Hackford, who had directed An Officer and a Gentleman. He also directed and co-wrote Ray, which starred Jamie Foxx, where he won an Oscar for Best Actor. And I thought that was interesting. So how is a white man directing a film that deals with Chicano culture? Well, it turns out that Taylor Hackford had actually grown up in East Los Angeles, and he actually had been around a lot of Chicanos. And a lot of it he was growing up with as with friends, and he knew their family. So basically, he was a part of the family in that community, and also learned how to speak Spanish as well too. I think he was also a member of the Peace Corps, where he was transferred over to Honduras, where he stayed there for a number of years before making his way back here to the States. So this was someone who was definitely very much invested in the Chicano culture. Although he's an Anglo man, but he definitely felt that he understood the culture well enough to be able to tell the story authentically and effectively as well too. But the one thing he had also had pointed out as well was that he needed a voice that would be able to tell the narrative that he wanted to focus on here, but tell it in an authentic manner. So he reached out to a poet by the name of Jimmy Santiago Baca, who basically had grown up in basically the same area that these characters have grown up in, at the same time also serving prison, and then learning to read and write there as well. And then he became a poet, and then along the way, had been asked to help write this film to give an authentic voice behind it. And that to me spoke a lot, where you could see where the limitations for Taylor had come, knowing that, okay, we need something else to be able to tell the story effectively. So let's bring someone else that could do it and doing this justice for us to be able to tell the story in an effective manner. And I thought that was a brilliant move to do, because once Jimmy Santiago had got involved with the story, you can definitely tell a lot of things had changed when it comes to what the overall narrative here. In fact, it got to the point where in the prison scenes, there's a Chicano warden who in the film is actually the real warden of San Quentin at that time. And he asked, well, if you want to shoot the movie here in this prison, I got to see the script. So Taylor Hackford, the director, had given him the script. He read the script and he came back. He said, "Who wrote this?" He's like, "Oh, it was co-written by Jimmy Santiago Baca." He's like, "Because this is very real. So yeah, you can make the movie here." So clearly that authenticity did help out in convincing the warden to be able to have the production shoot this film in San Quentin, which all those scenes are very much all in San Quentin, with a lot of the prisoners and a few actors along the way as well too, and the crew members. So there's a lot of authenticity when it comes to this movie, because you have the voice in Jimmy Santiago Baca to be able to tell that story in that effective manner. And I think it was, again, like I said before, it's very smart that Taylor Hackford did that to be able to tell that story in that way. One other thing I also want to point out here too is that although I am Hispanic, I am not familiar with every single Hispanic culture out there at all. I mean, I've grown up with a lot of Peruvians, Bolivians, Salvadorians, Guatemalans. I myself am a Nicaraguan American, but even as a kid growing up, I didn't really grow up with a lot of Nicaraguans, other than my brother, my sister, my mom and my dad, a few cousins that are spread out here and there. But otherwise, it was just not something that I was always around. And so whenever I'd go back to visit Nicaragua, I was very thankful because I got to be around that culture, because it's something I didn't get exposed to that often, other than what I was exposed to already at home. But having learned about the Chicano culture through this film, I'd known about it for some time from what I've seen on TV, where you get the more or less stereotype of an essay with the white beater and the khakis and the glasses, the mustache. That's something we've seen before on TV. But with this movie, it definitely educated me along the way too, where I actually got to really see what the culture was like. And I think that was actually a very beautiful way in telling the story, despite the fact it deals with gang culture. But the movie is much more than just that, in my opinion. And I think one thing the film has done very well is that it gave anyone who's never been exposed to this culture a piece of a window, basically, to see a piece of American culture, a piece of American pop culture, if you will, through this movie. Because I truly do believe that what you see in the film is a very authentic take on the Chicano culture, because it's done in a way where it's not a forced situation where you're having guys talking with the Chicano slang like, "Oh, chale con ustedes," and shit like that. It's done in a very authentic and organic way, so that when the characters are speaking in that more or less in that vernacular, it comes out organic. So there's not a forced situation where you see, like in some films where you have a Chicano type of a character playing an S, someone who's playing an S, if you will, where it just seems like a forced scenario. And as much as I thought at the time, I wouldn't say it bothered me, but I remember thinking like, oh, there's a lot more to than just this. I got to see something else with more substance. This movie gave the opportunity for me to see that in a different light, and offer me a side of America that I was not really familiar with at all. And it gave me that opportunity to see that and learn more about it along the way as well too. And then from there, I had actually learned more about the Chicano culture and the Chicano lifestyle as well from this movie, which gave me a chance to really take something that I had never been exposed to before, and then be able to carry along with me along the way. And now to the point where anyone that I've talked to that has seen the movie, almost everybody is talking in Chicano slang, where they're saying "Chala con ustedes" and "Qui huele champ" or "Orale Holmes" or shit like that. I think that's actually quite fun, to be honest with you, even though I'm not Mexican. But there are some Mexicans that I have come across who have seen this film that do really genuinely enjoy this movie, But to the extent of that, so that's really my only interactions when it comes to if there's any authenticity the film does offer when it comes to that culture. And it turns out that my brother-in-law actually grew up near that area because he was born and raised in California, and being around that environment, he's actually pointed out to me that that's very much true. But it's a part of the area of East Los Angeles where at that time was considered very, very dangerous. So obviously times have changed along the way too, but the fact that he was able to point out the authenticity behind that film as far as how the culture was portrayed, he pretty much did confirm it for me that is very much on point there when it comes to the representation of the culture, or the Chicano culture, if you will. One other thing I want to point out here too, because there's so much I can get about this film, but I'm going to say here one thing about the plot synopsis here is because as there are so many things that are happening in this film, and believe me, there's a lot that goes on in this movie, where you have Paco Aguilar, who is this tough guy who has a reputation of being the tough boy. At the same time, he's also the guy that has a perception about what's very important for him, which is like the gang life, if you will. And then one tragic event that occurred where his little brother had died through an accidental drug overdose, through the needles that his cousin, or in this case a brother, and Crucito was using, because he had been attacked by a rival gang that had broken his back, and he was in a lot of pain. So morphine was one way to help with the back pain, but eventually he ended up being addicted to drugs to help suppress the pain. And then with the addiction that he had gotten from the use of those drugs, his little brother, who admired him very highly, he decided to try it for himself and then just overdose in the process. And that particular moment changed everything for him, where he decided that from now on, he's on a mission to stop all the bad guys and take the drugs off the street because of what it did to his little brother, and having a lot of animosity towards his cousin Crucito as a result of that as well too. And then when there's the whole thing about Miklo and Paco also getting into an altercation with another rival gamer because of what they did to Crucito earlier in the film, that had put him in two different paths, where in this case, where Miklo, he ends up going to prison and serving almost 10 years. And Paco, was given an opportunity. Either you go to prison or you can go to the Marines. And so he decided to go to the Marines, and that changed his life forever. And as a result of, going through that, going to the boot camp. But it really was the fact until his brother had died from the drug overdose that made him the man that he is at that point. So you're seeing the arcs of these characters, of what they go through, having the high points and then the very low points as well too. And the high points for some of these characters, especially for Miklo, are unfortunately in really terrible circumstances where he's doing some stuff that are very, very questionable. But you always wonder at the end of the day, is he really the bad guy? To some degree, and I think in a lot of people's eyes, the answer would be yes. But when you understand his journey as why he is the way he is and how he got there, you honestly kind of sympathize with him, even though you may not agree with him. I certainly feel that way. I don't agree with him at all, but I do sympathize with the guy because I understand where he was coming from. Because being the fact that he is a mixed kid, that his father is white because he came out with blue eyes, light skin, and blonde hair, and his mother is Mexican, he was always ousted as the wannabe Chicano, if you will, and he always felt like I belong here. I am Chicano. I am Mexican. I don't care that my father is white. Why should that matter at all? I focus on me. There are a lot of people who are of mixed race that go through that as well. And seeing it through this man's eyes was a very, very unique experience, because the prejudice that he's dealt with here, the insults that are thrown at him, that's a very common thing that I think a lot of people may not realize. And to see that in this film, I thought was told in a very effective manner. So for someone who is not mixed at all, maybe like if you want to consider me mixed in terms of like some European background that I have in my bloodline here, maybe to that extent. But apart from that, I grew up Hispanic. I have my mom and my dad are both Hispanics, and they're born and raised in Nicaragua. I have cousins whose parents are Nicaraguans, Puerto Ricans, and Peruvians. So I definitely have that background in my life, but I never had. I just didn't grow up with a white dad and a Hispanic mom, or whatever the other way around. So I never really had that experience personally for myself to a degree, with the exception of the fact that I've had people tell me that I was white. They thought I was white because of the way I speak as well too. So, but that was never really a suppressing situation in my life. But I have seen people who were mixed that were always either ousted for, well, are you white or black? Are you Hispanic? Are you white? What's the deal? Because, your mom is this and your dad is that. and you act like this, and they're expecting to identify as something. When they do, they're like, well, you're not this enough, or you're not that enough. So there is a bit of that problem there that does occur, that I think this movie does handle quite well, but definitely through a perspective of one person here, because this is just a person's perspective, but it's a perspective that makes sense for that individual in the story that we're following here. So I thought that was actually really interesting to get that side of a mixed cultural background that we don't necessarily get a whole lot of here. But this movie, I think, did a really good job in showcasing that here for everyone here to check out. But then we also get the two other characters, and Crucito, who's the artist, who's the guy who's basically the interpreter, who is someone who is trying to find an answer in everything that he's doing here, trying to find the heart to the situation, if you will, whereas Miklo is someone who's just trying to fit in. Paco, on the other hand, is a guy that is more or less the leader, the tough guy, but just hasn't learned to really forgive himself and learn how to forgive other people properly, because he's so headstrong. It's got to be like this, and there's no wiggle room, but there's a lot of gray areas in people, which he has to learn to accept, especially when it comes to himself. So I think when it comes to the narrative that we're following here with each of these respective characters and all the other characters that they've come across along the way too, the payoff in the end of this film is a very fitting one. Unfortunately, depending on who you ask, of course, just the way that it ended for Miklo, although he doesn't die at all, but the way that it ended for him, it's a really sad one. But when you really think about it in hindsight, the guy did accomplish a lot, and something you just can't just look over and say, well, it is, it's nothing to be proud of it, which it isn't, but you got to give the guy props for putting in the work and being able to come on top, if you will. So there's just a lot of mixed feelings that I have about each of these respective characters and what they go through. But when you see how it all pays off at the end, it's a very fitting ending that I think works out, that does the job at the end of the day for me personally. So I can literally go on for hours about this here, and I'm hoping one day I can do a commentary of this film here on the channel. I'm still trying to work out the details, see if I'm going to pull it off, and if I am, how will it come out? We'll find out, and hopefully somewhere down the line here. But for me, that's going to be the end of my positives. So now let's get into my negatives. The only real negative that I have with the film are more just about some choices that are made when it comes to the mixing of the film, or when it also comes to the relationship that we get with certain characters. Like, one of the big major popular characters is Magic, who turns out to be the right-hand man to Miklo in the San Quentin prison. And Magic was a guy, when you look at, he looks cool. I mean, he has the mustache, the little strip here, and then the slick back hair, the big massive dude as well too, and he just has this like powerful presence about him, but he's the muscle to Miklo. And the one thing about this film is that you get to see the relationship that develops between these two characters and how they form this bond. Even to this day, as many times I've seen this movie, as much as I love that relationship, I actually wish we saw more about what really got them to click with each other, other than on surface level they happen to work together and then they agreed on some things along the way, and then that was it. I always felt like that we needed more time to really showcase of like what it was that really got them to click like that, where they realized that, yeah, we're bros for life. Like that's what I wanted to see. A lot like with what you got with Miklo and Rosito, and then of course Paco. Like, you get to see how they're introduced in the beginning of the film, and they have history, but you see that the history they've had and where they're just picking up where they last left off at this point, that there's a lot of strength in their bond, even though there's a lot of differences. But there's one unity about what they're wanting, which is the family bond, and how important it was for all of them, despite the fact that Paco was always was poking at Miklo for being half white and telling him not to do stupid shit around him, or whatever the case may be. And he's always like the kind of the bully, if you will. But you understood that the respect that they had for each other and how they're communicating with one another despite their differences, and yet they're still able to form a bond. And then when they're thrown up against the fire, that Paco decides to look out for his family and decides to stick with him, despite the fact that if he had just ran away and left him there, he would have probably never been caught and been in the situation that he's in, where he had to go, he would have been arrested and then serve time in the Marines and be the man that he is at this point. But you get to see that time that we had with them to develop that relationship made a lot of sense once you got to that point. And then what occurred after the fact, it made a lot of sense why it bothered him such a great deal and why he hated Miklo for what he had done, especially when you get to the end of the movie. But when it comes to Miklo and Magic, it's one of those things where I felt like we just needed more of that to really see what really made them click with each other. So that way, once you got to that part of the relationship, especially towards the end of the film, and how they're saying, I'm loyal to you and I'm loyal to you as well too. The impact I felt like would have been there. But again, on surface level, it made a lot of sense. It still worked effectively, but I think that was missing when it came to that part of the relationship. As far as some of the editing choices and the other aspects of the film, when it comes to the technical side of the film, some choices I felt like was kind of iffy when it came to the ADR or even some editing choices when it comes to how certain characters respond to a situation, and then it was abruptly with another response that comes in, they seem kind of out of place and forced. They didn't have like that fluidity from one scene to another, I meant to say, where it transitions quite well. Sometimes they kind of had that little abrupt cut where it just seemed a little out of place and a little uneven. Other times I felt like there were moments where you have these characters are saying certain lines that were good, but just the way that they were executed didn't deliver it as well as I thought it could have. So it's kind of hard for me to explain without really, unless I point out a specific set of details for you to check out, which is why I'm hoping to do a commentary for this one day. But it's just like that, where I felt like we could have had more time to be able to flesh out those transitions from one scene to another, work on the ADR a little bit better, the sound quality, and so on and so forth. I think that would have made the film that even, I wouldn't say much better, but a little bit less jagged, if you will. So I hope I made sense when I explained that here. But overall, I mean, even though I point out those imperfections in the film, this is a pretty damn near perfect film, because there's so many great qualities about this movie that this movie does have when it comes to telling their story of all these characters, even the side characters as well too. Well, you have characters that you don't think you would root for, but you are, and you find characters that are just in and out, but when they're in the film, they have a quite impactful moment in the movie, to the point where people memorize their lines, even though they're not in the film for that much, because they had an effective part of the overall story here. So there's quite a few things about this film that I can certainly point out that I really did love. And of course, just the slang that we hear in this movie, which I've heard to this day, a lot of people quote whenever I bring up Blood In, Blood Out, especially if they're very familiar with it here. So, I can go on for literally for many hours about why I think this movie is so good. But for me right now, that's going to be the end of my negatives. So now let's get into my rating. So I love this movie. And the one thing I want to point out too, and leading to my rating here, is that I appreciate the fact that we get to see a piece of American culture that I think a lot of us may not be aware of here, or may not be exposed to at all. And to be able to have this story to share that side of American culture, despite the fact that maybe some people may look at it, well, does that mean all Chicanos like that? No, it's not like that for everybody. But it's a piece of the culture that some of us may not be familiar with at all, because I certainly wasn't that familiar with it growing up, because I wasn't around that stuff. So to get an opportunity to check this out and seeing that part of American culture, if you will, I think is a great opportunity for people to understand that this does exist out there, and that I'm hoping that would hopefully generate some interest to learn more about this stuff as well too, and also the opportunity to be able to tell more story of the sort of this epic scale as well, because there are a lot of great things about about America that we get that I am not familiar with at all, that are here in this very country that I would love to learn more about. And I think being able to tell that through a form of a film or TV show is a great tool to be able to use this to tell an effective story, a great story where you get to see a side of American culture that many of us may not be familiar with at all, that we are able to tell through those lenses, if you will. So I say for me, this movie is a solid fucking cheers. And those are my thoughts on the film. And if you have seen this movie, let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the NRW. Make sure you guys share, like our videos, and hit the notification bell while you're down there as well. And also follow NRW on social media. On Instagram, New Release Wednesdays. On Facebook, Nerds Rule the World. And on Twitter at the NRW. And you guys also follow me on my social media accounts. On Instagram, You're So Cool with Rob Medina. On Facebook, Rob Medina. And also on Twitter, You're So Cool WRM. And also be on the lookout for my guest this week on my show, You're So Cool with Rob Medina, with Miss Jasmine Gillespie, who I think you guys are going to really take a liking to when you guys hear our conversation, because this is someone that I had the opportunity to learn some things about along the way that really piqued my interest, that I reveal something that I've never revealed at all here on my show and here on the channel at all. In fact, actually, that I think you guys may find hopefully either interesting and see why I decided to delve into this part of a story when it came to myself that I shared with her in that conversation here. So you guys be on the lookout for that when it drops this Friday here on the NRW. So that'll be at the review this week, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Until next time, stay safe out there and cheers.